In this video, we are going to expand upon blueprints a bit further, discuss some uses for them, code up a interactable button, and make it where we can actually escape from our room. We're going to fall to our deaths when we do, but we'll cover that in a later video. Let's go ahead and get started. Blueprints are useful for doing everything inside of your game. Let's go ahead and go into My Content, Blueprints. We'll go into Props, and we'll make a new blueprint class. We need to, again, think about what we're going to do here. This will be a button. The button's going to go down when we step on it, change colors, and interact with the player. We're not going to need to move it. We're not going to need to be able to control it. So we're just going to have a generic actor. We'll name this one Blueprint Trigger. And we'll go ahead and get right into it. Let's close up anything we've opened up already. And work on just our trigger itself. Oh, and since again I keep forgetting, let's go ahead and save everything. We'll hit save. And then save all. Now we're good. Actually, we'll go save here too. Now we're good. First thing I like to do, I'm going to go ahead and add component and type in scene. Type in scene. Rename this route and replace my default scene route with my custom route. Now we have a blank one. Button. What are we going to do for button? Well, let's add a static mesh. And let's name this button. And let's look for a static mesh. And actually, one of the first ones works for me. It's this 1 meter cube chamfer. Chamfer? Beveled, edged. It's the one with the curvy edges. We'll go with that. And let's set this up for how we want. It's too big. Well, actually, the only way of knowing for sure, let's put this in our scene. Let's grab our trip box, slap it down, put it in our scene. And actually, you're going to notice one of those things we were talking about before. You notice when I hit end, it goes through the scene. Well, the bottom of this item, this blueprint, is determined by our pivot point, our bottom 0 point. The 0 point is actually in the middle of our box, so we're going to need to adjust that. Let's make our box half as tall. Let's make it 0.5. We'll compile and save, and we'll see what this looks like. Let's drop this down, zoom in, and bring it back up. That's what it's going to look like on our scene. And that's not bad. That'll work. But our pivot point is still an issue. That's what our route's for. Our route determines where the pivot point is. It's going to be this 0, 0 point on our scene, or it's going to be where this green and red line intersect. If we look at our button, it's actually too high up. Let's drag this up a little bit, and you're actually going to see that right there. And we'll hit compile and save. Go back in here, hit end, and we'll see what it looks like in our scene. And it looks like it's going through a little bit. For our example, though, that's going to work. That's actually going to work perfectly fine. We're going to go ahead and we're going to want this to be right there, so it looks like it's kind of part of the floor. Okay, so we're good. Let me maybe move this a little bit. We'll move it maybe right about there. This is just nitpicking. But anyways, we have our button. What are we going to want to do for the button? Well, it looks like gray right now, so let's fix that. We'll go into materials. We'll make a new material, and we'll call this one the material trigger. And open it up. This one's going to be super simple. We're going to hold down 3 and click and create a 3 vector. Put it into emissive and change it. We're going to want the button to look red when we're not doing anything with it. So let's change our values to RGB100 or red for our color and hit apply. What this is going to do is it's going to set up our material, as you can see here, as a red emissive color. Why do I want it emissive? Well, let's go into our trigger. Let's go into our cube material. And we name this one, I think, called a trigger. We'll search for trigger and trigger. We'll compile it and look, and there we go. It gives us this kind of little like, glow effect. Not only that, it's always going to be visible inside of our scene. So when we look, it's not affected by light at all. It's this nice red effect. And actually, it's kind of cool because it's emissive. You can actually see it reflected off the player a little bit. So we have this little red. One cool thing about emissive Emissive is basically an overdriven color. What do I mean by that? Traditionally, in our RGB setup, we have 0 through 1. 0 being none value, 1 being full value. So full red would be 1. However, we can drive this over 1 when it's connected to emissive, and it makes it really bright and it gives it a glow. We'll change this to 3 and hit save and look at this circle. Go ahead and hit apply and look in here, and we're going to get a brighter red. See how it almost gives us that little bit of glowing effect? We'll go in here and look, and we have this nice little red glowing thing. We should not be able to miss this by any means. Let's go ahead and go back out, and we'll close down our material for now. We will get back to that in a second. Now we have our button. What do we want to do with our button? Well, we want it to change to green when we step on it, and we want it to go down when we step on it. And then we're going to make it open the door, but we want to make sure the button works first. So we got a couple things there. How do we make the button turn green? How do we make the button move? And then honestly, the first thing, how do we even make the button interact with the player? If we set up how we interact with the player first, without any way of knowing that we've interacted with them, we're not going to have a visual indicator that it works. So let's have a visual indicator it works first. Let's make our button change colors. In order to do that, we are going to work on dynamic materials. And we're going to work on material parameters. Basically, that is a way of talking to a material, telling it to change something, and then the material changing it. If we open up our material and we look at our color, this is what we want to change. Right now, we have no way of telling this material to change it. It is a static or a constant value. If we right-click and convert to parameter, it's going to change it. It's going to keep the value, but it's going to change it to a parameter, and it's going to give it a name of none. Let's change our name to color. And what this is going to do is now if we talk to this material and talk to the color parameter, we can change its value. That's it. As simple as that. We're done with our material now completely. Close it down. Actually, let's hit save. Close it down, and boom, we're done. And you'll notice nothing changed. We still have our button. It's still glowing, and nothing's changed. Now we need to be able to have our blueprint talk to the material. And we'll do that inside of our event graph. Our event graph is where we hold all of our code. Well, technically, there's the construction script, and there are other event graphs. But your normal place is the event graph. By default, it's going to come with a few different things. The event tick is something we're not going to use. It basically, every time a frame is drawn on the screen, this will be called and something will happen. We're not going to worry about the actor beginning overlap because we don't want any collision with the actor. We're going to do something separate. We're going to want the begin play. Begin play is basically when this actor exists, when it becomes part of our world, this is going to happen. Something's going to happen. Anything connected to this node right here, this little, what is that, sideways triangle? Baseball diamond maybe? American baseball diamond? Yeah. Stuff is going to happen. By stuff, I mean it's going to go from left to right. Traditionally, you can always wire this backwards or up and down if you want. But traditionally, it's going to take this little wire here, execute, and fire off something else. What do I mean by that? We're going to use dynamic materials. If we right-click and type in dynamic material and spell it properly, we're going to get a few options. This right here is your context-sensitive blueprint palette pop-up. Basically, right-click, tell it what you want to find, and it'll find it if it's appropriate. There's two options. In here, for example, I could type in controller, and I get a bunch of options that say controller. Actually, let's find, let's do set UI. Here we go. We get a couple options here. By default, it's going to show context sensitive. What that means is only things that are appropriate should show up. If we uncheck this, it's going to find everything. Now, what do I mean by that? Right now, we're not dealing with anything. I just right-clicked. So it's going to find things that are appropriate to what we're doing, which is our generic set input mode and this make string asset reference and set members and GUID. These are things not hooked up to anything else. If I uncheck it, we're going to find stuff like set UI sound, set fluid friction. These are things that are connected to other things. The set UI sound is part of the audio component. It's only going to work when it's hooked up to an audio component. Because of that, because we're not saying, okay, I want to see what's connected to an audio component, we're just saying, I want to talk to everything, it's not going to show it. It's going to know, you know what? You're not talking about an audio component. Let's not show you that. So by default, context sensitive unchecked is going to be it's going to work most of the time. If you're looking for something and you find you can't find it, you're probably going to want to uncheck this. For our examples, we're fine. The other option is our palette. You can go to Windows Palette, and it's going to show up here, and it's basically going to show you everything. Sorry, right here, library. It's going to show you everything. It's going to show you this pop-up list, unfiltered, with a whole bunch of stuff. And you can see you can break it down. I personally don't use the palette. It's nice because you have some shortcuts and some favorites. But once you get used to the way this works, you're basically going to drag off, type in what you're looking for, do something, drag off, type what you're looking for, and you're going to let the context sensitivity work. So let's do that. The way the nodes work is it will fire the execute pin, which is this line here, and then go to the next node. So in this case, we typed in dynamic material earlier, and we have a few options. Create dynamic material instance, create dynamic material instance button, and then a few casting. What we're going to want is this bottom one, create dynamic material instance button. If you notice, each of these actually say a little description, creates a dynamic material instance, which you can modify, or creates a dynamic material instance for the specified element index, optionally from the supplied material. These basically look the same, but they're slightly different. We want this one because it references button, and we're going to change the material on the button. So if we do this, we'll find that it hooks it up with our execute wire. It was nice enough to hook up our target as the button because we told it, hey, we want to change the button. And then it filled in anything else. Now you can easily move any node. You can use the keyboard to move them as well. And you can move any of these sub connections. And you'll notice blueprints are really nice because it's a visual scripting language. If we read this from left to right, we were going to say, okay, begin play. Follow the white wire. What do we do next? Well, we create a dynamic material instance. Our target is going to be our button. Our element index is going to be 0. And our source material is going to be nothing. Okay? And then it's going to do that. And then it's going to return back a material instance dynamic reference. It's going to return back the item we just created, a dynamic material. Well, what do we do now? We want to keep track of that. We want to say, okay, start up, create me a dynamic material, and then let's go ahead and save a reference to that. And that's pretty simple. We can drag off the execute, type in another node, or you can drag off an output pin, one of these little outputs. Input pins are on the left, outputs are on the right. You drag off and it'll be context sensitive for this. Anything we can do to this is going to show up here. And your first one is going to be promote to variable. When we do that, we get a little node, we organize it. Organization is key. And by default, it's now a generic name. On the left, under our My Blueprint, is all of the stuff about My Blueprint. We'll find things such as our components, our button and our root, which we have up here, the variable, which we just created, any functions, any event graphs, any event dispatchers, just a whole bunch of stuff. For what we want is our variable we just created, and we want to name it. Keeping things organized is smart. We can go ahead and click on it and hit F2 on Windows, or right-click and rename. And we're going to rename this to Dynamic Material Instance. Really simple, really easy to remember. If you were to see this variable and you were to wonder, what is that? I think you could figure it out by the name. So now that we have our Dynamic Material Instance, what are we going to do with it? Well, I mentioned earlier, if we go into our trigger, we have a parameter in here called color that allows us to control the color. So what we want to do is now talk to our dynamic material instance, tell it to change the color. We have two ways of doing this. When we promoted this to a variable, we set it up as the dynamic material instance. We said, hey, this right here, dynamic material instance, it is what we just created here. But this node right here was like, you know what? You just saved it as a dynamic material, as this variable name. You might want to use it sometime soon. So I'm going to go ahead and give you an output pin. So we can just hook this up and do what we want from here. So for example, I would want to, that would be a vector. So I type in vector, and of course, context sensitive, and we'll look in here and we'll see, oh look, set vector parameter value. Set vector parameter value on the dynamic material instance. If we do this, you actually find this really funky node pops up. It was trying to help us by hooking up our dynamic material instance, but we had already hooked it up here, so we got this really funky thing. Let's delete that. We don't need it this time. We'll go back to set vector parameter value, and you'll notice it's all hooked up. Alternatively, like I mentioned before, we'll go ahead and get rid of this. We'll drag off of this one this time, and we'll do set vector parameter value. And we'll have the same thing here. Now this one is on a material parameter collection. Here's one of the issues you're going to run into. When I dragged off of here and I did set vector, you saw two different nodes with the same name. Unfortunately, it's going to happen. You're going to have the same name. You're going to have sets and gets especially. You're going to have to pay attention to the description. We know we're working with the dynamic material instance, or an MID, material instance dynamic. This one says the target is the material library. And it says it sets a vector parameter on material collection. This one says sets an MID, material instance dynamic, vector parameter value. That's the one we want. And when we click on it, you'll notice we actually get something different. This one says it's targeting a collection. This one says the target is the material instance dynamic. So let's go ahead and delete that one again. That was just a way of getting things. You'll notice when we did the vector this way, we got a bunch of options. When we did it this way, we actually got less. It knows the correct one because we're saying, here's a material instance dynamic. What can we do? Well, we can set a vector directly to it. And there we go. Now the last way, after all that stuff, is to actually use the variable we created out of our variable list to do the same thing. If we drag our material vector out and we tell it we want to get it, we want to get this variable, it's going to give us this little note. Now we do the same thing, set vector, and there we go. Simple as that. A bunch of different ways to do the same thing. The key here is finding the right node for what we're trying to do, and then making sure it's hooked up properly. Let's delete this stuff and hook this up, and then hit compile. And we'll watch what happens. We get an error. The target for these nodes is important. The target determines what it's going to work on. In this case right here, the dynamic material instance creation node needs to target a primitive component. It needs to target something that is of type primitive component in order to do its magic. Now, a button is a primitive component, so that's why we've set it up as the target. For here, we're setting a vector parameter material. The target is a material instance dynamic. By default, with nothing plugged in, it's going to go to self. Our self is an actor. If we look at our parent class up here, it's an actor. It is not a material instance dynamic. It's going to fail, and your error is going to say, this blueprint self is not a material instance dynamic. Therefore, target must have a connection. So you need to fill in the blanks. That's it. Okay. We need a material instance dynamic that we want to set the value on. Do we have one? Well, we have one here, and we have one here. Let's drag it out of here, drop it on, boop, there we go. Clean it up, hit compile, our error goes away. What parameter do we want to change? Hopefully you know this one. On our material, what is the parameter name we want to change? Color. Okay, change the color. What is the value of what we want to do? Well, this is a linear color. We could either create another variable and plug it in, or click and pick a color. I think we're going green, right? We'll go with green. And we want to overdrive it, so we'll go with 3. There's our value, green. Now if we walk through this from left to right, we start playing. We create a dynamic material from our button. We set that dynamic material to a variable called dynamic material instance. This is just a place to hold what we created. And then on what we created, we tell it to change the color parameter to green. That's it. So now if we were to go into here, we notice it's red. We'll hit play. We'll run. And we have green. We didn't touch it. We haven't set up our trigger. But what we've done is basically tested that what we're doing works. We have tested that this little snippet of nodes here will allow us to change the color to green. Now this part right here, we don't want hooked up once we do the rest of it. But we now know how to create and set a color on a material. Now the next part, now that we've done that, is let's make it happen when the player walks on it. In order to do that, we're going to use collision. Let's go ahead and set up our basic collision. We have a component for collision. We go down to collision. We have box, capsule, and sphere. We're going to use box because it's going to represent the top part of our area when the player steps on it. We're going to move our box up a little bit. Let's say something like that. We're going to resize it. Now we know what size is this. Our cube is 1 meter, so if we did our box something like 50 by 50, it should fit. The nice thing, we have all of our viewports. We can go to top, we can look, and yes, our box fits perfectly. Go back to perspective. We'll change our vertical to something like 10. Move it down, and there we go. Now whenever the player steps on, whenever the player collides with this area right here, this collider, something's going to happen. Right now, nothing's going to happen. We haven't told it to do anything. We need to set up an event. An event is basically a reaction to something happening. The box collider that we've created, let's call this one collider. The box collider has a bunch of events plugged in. If we go into the details panel and we look, we find, I don't know, 15 or so, with a whole bunch of different options. We're going to want to know when the player touches the trigger, when the component begin overlap. On component begin overlap is basically when something overlaps this component, this trigger, we're going to want something to happen. So we'll go over to here and hit the plus button, and it's going to create this nice little node. This is our event on component begin overlap collider. When something collides, do something. Now you've already seen code up here when we begin play. This is the code we want to happen when something collides. We can duplicate it or we can move it. Let's move it. Using the Alt key, you can disconnect any node. If I drag off of here, it'll drag off. If I hit the Alt key and click, it'll disconnect it. I can select these nodes, physically move them over, and wire them in. Now what are we doing? We are saying, hey, when you overlap with something, and the only thing that's going to move in our game right now is our player. When you overlap with something, set the value to green. Okay, let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. We have red. We'll walk on top of it. We have green. Simple as that. The player collided with our collider. It overlapped it. Our player physically overlapped this square. It said, okay, boom, what do we want to do? Boom, we want to change the color. Color to green. That's it. That's as simple as that. That's all we have to do for that. Now we want to do a little bit of an animation. we want it where the button goes down. We'll add in sounds and particles. That'll be covered in the next section. But let's go ahead and animate the button going down itself. Where would we do this? And when would we do it? Do we want to make the button go down and then turn green? Or do we want to make the button turn green and then go down? I'm going to go ahead and have the button go green and then go down. So it's pretty simple. Again, left to right. We're going to want to add that code after it turns green, right here. Now, how are we going to do that? A super simple way of doing things over time is to use what's known as a timeline. If we right-click and type in timeline, you'll find add timeline. We add a timeline, we name it. We're going to call this one, trigger timeline. Sure, why not? And we have a node called a trigger timeline. Now you notice this one is colored differently. That's because it's actually got stuff in it. If we double click on this, nothing's going to happen. If we double click on this, nothing's going to happen. If we double click on our timeline, we actually are taken to the ability to edit the timeline. The timeline is a start to finish line that has points on it, and those points are whatever you determine. Now, what do I mean by points? Well, let's open up our timeline and let's look at it. How long do we want this to be? How long is it going to take from the time we step on the button till the time the button is down? Let's make it 1 second. So we'll change the length to 1 second. What are we going to do? Well, let's think about this visually. We have our button here. And if we click on our button, what do we want to happen? Well, we want to go down. Okay, well, let's go down. Okay, and we're going to go up and down. So if we look over here, and we look at our Z is at negative 280. If we want the button to go down to, let's say here, our Z is now at negative 320. Our X and our Y haven't moved. We haven't adjusted our X and our Y. We're just adjusting our Z up and down. So what we're going to do is simply, over 1 second, change our Z from negative 280 to negative 320. So we're going to adjust one value. We go back into our timeline. We're going to adjust one value. It's a float. A float is a single value. And we'll do float. And we'll do this one, the new Z. This will be the new Z that we want to set it to. You'll notice by default, it's going to set up like this. And you're going to have your length shown in this lighter color. 0 seconds to 1 second. 0 value to whatever values you've determined. If you zoom out, you'll get bigger values. You zoom in, you get smaller values. You can use these nice little guys to set everything up based on what you've set up. Let's make this super simple. We're going to want a starting and an ending. 2 points. Right-click anywhere on your graph and add a key. Now, I'm going to make this as simple as possible and add it one at the beginning and one at the end. A starting and an ending. Our starting should be at 0 for the time. If we click on it and type in 0, that's our time. What is our value going to be? Well, we already looked at this, and we want our value to be negative 280. Now, I know it said negative 279.99999. With floating point, there's rounding errors. Negative 279.9994, whatever it ends up with, it's close enough to negative 280. Just consider it negative 280. It's floating point, rounding, precision errors. Look it up if you want more information. But basically, it's negative 280. So we want our starting value to be negative 280. Well, what do we want our ending value to be? We'll move it down, and we'll end it at negative 320. We'll go ahead and go to our ending value, 1 second for the time, and negative 320. You'll notice everything disappeared. That's because it went off our graph. We'll go and just hit both of our buttons, and there we go. Now we have a 0 time, negative 280, 1 second in, negative 320. So as long as we get the value, from here, we're going to basically, our button's going to smoothly change that number. We can close this, and we're done. This is our timeline. Let's hook up our timeline to play or play from start. Either one works. I'm going to go with play from start. The difference is if we hit play and then somewhere in the middle of this we pause it or stop it, for example, or we're in the middle of it. Let's say we're halfway down and then the button triggers again and we have it set to play, it's just going to play from where it is. If we have it play from start, it's going to start back over at 0. Let's just do play from start. So how do we do this? Well, we saw physically how we want to do this. We're just going to replicate it in code. We want to move this actor down. We want to change the location of this actor, and we want to change the Z value from -280 to -320. We have a nice convenient little graph here that changes it from -280 to -320. This shouldn't be hard. Let's see how hard it is. The timeline triggers basically every frame that it can trigger, and it's going to run the update, anything plugged into the update, and it's going to update the Z value based on how far along it is. So if it's at 0 seconds, it'll be the 0 seconds on our timeline. If it's at 0.25 seconds, it'll be this value, and you can see it all the way down. 0.66 seconds is going to give us a value of -306. All we care about is this timeline is going to give us a nice clean value. We're going to set actor location. Set actor location is what we're looking for. The actor is this right here, our root. This is an actor. Our blueprint is an actor. Remember, we're using that as our parent class. Our root location is what we see here, -280. We want to set it to a different value. So if we do update, and we do set actor location, spelling it again correctly this time, we're going to get set actor location. Now you notice this one has a target of self, and if we hit compile, no error. Well, we are an actor, and it's looking for an actor. We're good to go. Now we need to set the location. If you look at this vector, it consists of an X, a Y, and a Z. It's 3 different values. We only want to change the Z. We want to use the existing X and Y. There's a few ways of doing this. I like the easy way. The easy way is because Unreal Engine allows us to break apart things, break apart what are known as structures. This is a structure. The vector is 3 floats. If we were to right click and split the struct pin, we can actually now see we have an X, a Y, and a Z. We can now do this. There we go. Now every time it updates, our Z value is going to be whatever value on that 0 to 1 seconds. It's going to be our -280 to -320. Don't hit play. It's not going to work right. We are telling it, however, that we want the X and the Y to be 0 every time. And that's not what we want. Now, if we can set the actor location, we should be able to get it, right? Well, get actor location. Oh, there we go. And, well, unfortunately, we have a vector. But we only want the X and the Y. Well, this should be simple enough. Right-click, split. There's our X and our Y. Plug in our X, plug in our Y, and don't plug in our Z. We'll move this over here. We're going to use Reroute Notes. Any line, any execute wire, any connecting wire, you can double click on. You'll get a little node, and it'll let you rewire everything. We'll add another one here, and wire it over here. And we just went from that nice little ugly monstrosity to a little bit cleaner. See how it's nice and clean, everything's in order. We can even move stuff over like that. There we go, a little cleaner. So what are we doing here? Every time the timeline updates between 0 and 1 second, it is going to set the actor location. Us, our trigger. We are the trigger. We're doing this inside the trigger. So it's going to set our location to the current X value of the actor, the current Y value of the actor, and then our new Z location. Our new Z being one of those values on our timeline. And this should happen after we've changed it to green, after we collide on it. Let's see what happens. We'll hit play. We'll wander over. We'll click. And there we go. We went down. It changed to green. We have a small issue. We're actually going to go ahead and correct that right now. And that's going to happen when we walk on it again. You'll notice it goes down again. And it's going to continue going. Well, why is that? The blueprint is doing literally everything we've told it to do. Whenever you collide with the collider, go ahead and change it to green and trigger our timeline. We're not telling it to only trigger once. We're not telling it we've already triggered. We're just literally doing the same thing over and over. There's a few ways of fixing this. We can get rid of the collider, then you'll never collide again. We could hold a variable that says, have we collided? And if we've collided, then don't collide again. I'm going to go with the easy way. We only ever want to collide once, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to collide once. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to find my collision, and we're going to drag it out. These are all items that physically exist. We have a root, a button, and a collider. We can drag these out like any other variable and get a reference to them. So now that I know this collider right here, I want to go ahead and destroy it. I'm going to destroy component. This is a component, because as you saw in here, add component and components. Blueprints are comprised of components, and we want to destroy it. And we're going to have it destroy it first thing, so that way we can only ever step on this once. Now again, we read through this left to right. We overlap. Destroy the component. Well, what component? Well, the target is our collider. So destroy our collider. Set the vector parameter material value. What are we doing? Well, on this dynamic material instance, change it to green. And then trigger our timeline, which is moving. We'll run it again. Wander over here. Goes down. We're good. And then every time we walk over it again, nothing. Now to show that working, this is one of the cool things. There is a ton of debug options. If I pull up the console by the tilde key, and I type in show collision, we're going to see all of our collision inside of our game. And if you look on the button, which hopefully won't be too hard to see, you can see the collider on the top. When we walk on it, you're going to see the collider disappear because we've destroyed that collider. It is no longer there, and we cannot collide. Go ahead and shut that off. And we are now good to go with that. This is going to wrap up our video. We have set up our button. We have a few more things to do, such as creating a door we cannot escape from, and hooking the door up to the button so we can escape. And that's going to be covered in our next video.